What's going on, everybody? It is about 8:50 on Monday evening. Made a first attempt at this and then double-checked the polls when I got home to make sure I recorded the right video when I did not. So by popular demand this time, narrowly, it was 5 votes to 4 votes to 3 votes. We're going to talk about Jund in Modern in the wake of Modern Horizons this week on Riding in Cars with Cards. This is the show by me, an MTG dad, medium Magic player, somebody who really loves this game, but not to the point where I let it actively hinder my life goals. And this is the area where we talk about specific decks, specific formats, and, the ever-changing landscape of Magic metagames. So, Jund has kind of had a rough way of it recently. It is the quintessential, attempting to be 50-50 deck. That, in a nutshell, that is what Jund is. You are seeking to exchange resources with your opponent at a fairly good clip early in the game. Make sure the board state stays fairly simple, and then take over late in the game because you're both top decking and your cards are better. That's the philosophy behind the deck. As such, cards that take away from your opponent are more powerful than cards that give to you in this strategy. Unless they are cards that allow you to get back ways to take away from your opponent. For the longest time, there was the belief that Bloodbraid Elf would be the card that revitalized Jund in Modern. It really wasn't. Dark Confidant's good. But what really has helped this deck kind of reassert itself onto the modern landscape is the addition of Wrenn and 6 from Modern Horizons. For those of you who don't know, Wrenn and 6 is a 2-mana Planeswalker. This many. 2-mana Planeswalker. And unlike the last one, cough, cough, Tybalt, Brett, I don't care how good the Oathbreaker deck is, card's bad. Wrenn and 6 is really good. +1, return a land from your graveyard to your hand. -1, Wrenn and 6 deals 1 damage to any target, I think it is. And then -7 is instants and sorceries in your graveyard have retrace. So you get an emblem with instants and sorceries in your graveyard have retrace. There are 2 things that happen a lot when you're playing Jund. 1, either the game is over really quickly because everything clicks properly, or at some point in the game you have both exchanged resources, you're both top decking, and because you're Jund, you're drawing a lot of lands. Wrenn and 6 helps combat that 2 different ways. First, it buys back your fetch lands early in the game so that you can continue to thin lands out of your library. The thinning is fairly negligible, but it's not nothing. It also, buying back cycling lands, buying back the canopy land late in the game, the card is just really, really good at doing exactly what you need it for, just by rebuying lands. But then eventually you tick up to the point where your opponent either has to kill it, they have to waste a premier removal spell on it. On Wrenn and 6 instead of your Liliana of the Veil. And the combo there is also really nice because you can Thoughtseize on 1 or Inquisition on 1, and then you can Wrenn and 6 on 2, buy back a land, and then on 3 you can play that land, activate, play that fetch land, activate it again, cast your Liliana, and then plus Wrenn and 6 to get back your fetch land, and then activate Liliana, making both players discard a card. That's so good. It's just little intrinsic bits of value where normally what would be 1-for-1 exchanges come out like half a card in your favor. That's what Jund is about. That's how you win. Half a card at a time. Sometimes that's enough early in the game where half a card is everything you need. But other times, it's not enough. The thing about Jund in Modern is it's infinitely customizable. It's flexible in that you can tune it to adapt and attack a lot of different metagames. You can go heavier on discard and play cards like, Traverse the Ulvenwald, and I've even seen builds of Jund that play Death Shadow with, the Death Shadow Teamer Battle Rage alongside Traverse in a Jund deck, because all these Thought Seizes and Inquisitions and Fetch Lands and Shock Lands and everything adds up pretty quick. You can really aggressively take your life total down, and then all those discard spells keep your combo opponents from going off, and then you just kill them with a giant Death Shadow out of nowhere. Like, that's a thing you can do sometimes. But the big thing for Jund in Modern right now is the landscape. There was a long time where Mardu Pyromancer was better Jund. It just was. It was better Jund. You exchanged resources at an efficient clip early in the game, just like Jund did, but then you had Faithless Looting, and you had Bedlam Reveler, and you had Young Pyromancer, and you had Kolaghan's Command. Like, why would you play Tarmogoyfs and Lilianas and Dark Confidants? Bedlam Reveler draws 3 cards and doesn't cause life loss. Dark Confidant draws 1 card, maybe 2, and if you hit your Bloodbraid Elf, you might just die. Why would you do that to yourself? Well, now you don't have to. The addition of Wrenn and 6 to the archetype makes it to where they don't necessarily have to play cards like Bloodbraid Elf. You might still play 1 or 2, but you're not jamming all 4 in there and hoping for the best. Because it makes your confidence a little bit worse. It's a relatively low impact turn 4 play in a format that's got a lot of really high impact turn 3 plays. So going away from that is something I can wholeheartedly endorse. Assassin's Trophy is a huge deal for that deck too. That's one of the biggest boons to the deck that really helped bring it back into the spotlight over Mardu. Mardu doesn't get Assassin's Trophy. Mardu doesn't get to blow up Tron lands. Mardu doesn't get to punish greedy mana bases by just getting a sinkhole. Punishing a greedy mana base is a valuable tactic to be able to employ in Modern, for sure. And then, I mean, if you really want to press the issue, you're in Jund colors. One of those colors is red. You can play a Pyromancer shell in Jund if you really, really want to. I'm not saying you should, but you can. The biggest draw to white in Mardu specifically is Lingering Souls. It's like the only draw to white, it's like Lingering Souls and Kaya's Guile. That's it. Whereas in Jund, you can pick up Tarmogoyf, you can pick up Assassin's Trophy, you can pick up Maelstrom Pulse, you can pick up Abrupt Decay, you pick up good sideboard cards. Like, Ancient Grudge you can cast out of your graveyard after milling it with Faithless Looting. Like, there's a lot of reasons to like green. It also gives you a cleaner out to Leyline of the Void, just by virtue of having access to green mana. You have more cards that interact with artifacts and enchantments than having to awkwardly splash Wear and Tear or what have you. But at its core, Jund has kind of 3 classifications of cards, and I want to go over the cards that fit in those niches and like possible configurations involving them. So the first thing Jund is disruptive. You want to play some number, usually somewhere between 6 and 8, discard spells, disruption spells. Arguably, it's somewhere between 8 and 10, depending on how many Lilianas you run. But you want some number of Thoughtseize plus Inquisition of Kozilek. It's usually in more mid-range style Jund, you're favoring your Inquisitions, where if you're playing Death Shadow or more aggressively slanted Jund, you're favoring Thoughtseize, just because Thoughtseize takes anything where Inquisition has to take a 3 or less, so you don't have the benefit of being able to hit a Cryptic Command or a Gurmag Angler or, big stupid card A that you can't beat with the rest of the cards in your hand. The thing that Thoughtseize and Inquisition add to the deck in a major way is they add information. It gives you the ability to know what your opponent's up to and play accordingly. I can't really tell you just how valuable that is. It's one of the best things about playing mid-range in Modern if you decide to go down that road. I don't heartily endorse it, but if you're comfortable in that line, like being a less powerful deck, even though you have more powerful individual cards, and being able to sculpt game states and being able to play from behind a lot, like Jund is somewhere you'd be comfortable at in Modern. The other potentially, effective disruptive tool, Liliana the Veil, just as a grinding piece of card advantage, steadily making your opponent discard cards because, again, we're going to draw a lot of lands. Wrenn and 6 is going to make sure we don't need to use all of them. Dark Confidant's going to draw a bunch of lands. Dark Confidant's going to help us draw a bunch of cards we don't use. Liliana's going to put them to use by trading them for a card from our opponent's hand, essentially. Sometimes she's going to be a removal spell. A lot of the time, Liliana's just a discard spell. Over and over and over until your opponent is exhausted, and then you ult, and then they die. But that's Liliana. She's really good. Really, really, really good. Alternately, sometimes one of the Liliana the Veil slots, like if you're willing to play 3 and bump your disruption count up to 9, sometimes one of your Liliana the Veil slots, you bump back down to 8, and one of them becomes Liliana the Last Hope as a recursive engine. But it really just depends on what your version of Jund is trying to do. Other notable disruptive elements, sideboard cards are cards like Duress, Leyline of the Void against graveyard strategies, Surgical Extraction against both graveyard-dependent strategies and decks that need specific cards in order to go off, because you can Thoughtseize a card out of their hand and then Surgical the rest of them. It's not great, but it's not nothing, Sometimes you can just Surgical a pump spell out of Infect and not die on turn 3. Ask Matt Kling. But yeah, disruptive elements are key, because if you're going to play fair in a format like Modern, you got to make sure you can make everybody else play fair too. The next category in Jund is removal. It's interactive elements to stuff on the board. Like, your disruption takes care of stuff that's not on the board. Your removal takes care of the stuff that is. So the first removal spell, it's ubiquitous, arguably the best one, Lightning Bolt. 3 damage, any target, get them. Yes, I just did finger guns. I'm a dad. What do you want from me? You're going to be doing finger guns when you bolt Teferi Time Raveler, or bolt Teferi Hero Dominaria, or bolt, Big Stupid Creature X to finish it off, or to, bolt upstairs to win the game. It's the thing we get to do, especially thanks to Wrenn and 6. That is the most exciting thing about Wrenn and 6 to me. The little snippets of value along the way are great. I love them. I'm a sucker for value-oriented mid-range decks. But the idea of getting to a position where all my lightning bolts and all my lands in my hand turn into lightning bolts, that is so appealing to me as someone who's flooded myself out of 1,000,000 games of Magic. Being able to turn the lands that I draw into lightning bolts at my opponent's face and or, assorted creatures on the board so I can maintain some semblance of a clean, easy board state. Honorable, next best removal spell. Normally this would be Fatal Push. I'm going to go Assassin's Trophy. Destroy target permanent is 3 very, very powerful words. Destroy target permanent. And you can't even get locked out of it by, like, you don't get that awkward moment where you target it and then, like, your opponent can't redirect to something of yours because it's target permanent and opponent controls. So, like, weird little swerve cards don't actually work very well against Assassin's Trophy. And as greedy as a lot of mana bases are in Modern, and with the existence of Tron, sometimes the card's just sinkhole when you need it to be. And you're in the right colors to be able to board into additional land destruction, like Molten Rain or Pillage or Fulminator Mage. All of these cards are good. All of these cards are very good at doing exactly what you need to do. But again, destroy target permanent is a very powerful set of 3 words. And then it's, an opponent controls, and then they get to, it's Path to Exile, but it destroys a permanent instead of exiling a creature. Still really good. Get the Teferi off the table. 2 mana. Really strong. Then we go to Fatal Push, which, is the tempo efficient godsend for this deck. Being able to kill any creature that costs essentially 4 or less. Revolt is a lot easier to trigger in Modern than it ever was in Standard. The card was a mainstay in its time in Standard just because it traded with all the 2-drops or less. And the fact that it also sometimes would trade up to a 4. In Modern, it can trade up to a 4 basically anytime you need it to. You can find a way. Especially when you're playing Wrenn and 6 and fetch lands. You can just buy back a fetch land, crack it, push, got them. Now, push doesn't hit what it used to. We have cards like Hogak and, bunches and bunches of Planeswalkers. Cards that don't mind being in the graveyard, like Seasoned Pyromancer, or as we lovingly refer to it here at Goose's, Cajun Pyromancer. Still makes me chuckle a little bit every time I say that. Delve creatures in general are not very good against it. But, Fatal Push, being able to just take a Devoted Druid off the table in response to a Vizier of Remedies on the stack. Being able to just kill random creatures out of that one poor sap who showed up to play with, an actual aggro deck that you are not remotely prepared for because nobody plays those in Modern. Style points. Try it once. It's so much fun. You're going to lose to all the combo decks and probably some of the control decks. But, like, any of the decks that are geared to play fair, that are trying to play, like, not hyper-efficient removal, you can really get somebody with aggro in Modern. It's still fun. Give it a shot. Fatal Push is a really good catch-all for that situation. And then other additional removal that falls into kind of the flex slot category. Maelstrom Pulse just gets around all those token swarms. Get them all out of here. 3 mana. Also, solves the problem of Planeswalkers. Solves the problem of, token swarm. Solves the problem of multiple artifacts in play. Like, you can kind of get your opponent sometimes if they're trying to, if they get multiple copies of Leyline of the Void in play. I don't know why they'd board those in against you, but it's a thing that some people decide to do because it makes Goyf weaker. I don't know. I don't recommend it. Pulse being able to just get things off the table. And then, God, what was the other one? I had it on the tip of my tongue. Abrupt Decay. It's a worse Assassin's Trophy. It only destroys non-land permanents, and only if they cost 3 or less. But it can't be countered. So they have to sit there and stare at the remands in their hand while you're killing their Delver or their, otherwise important permanent card. Whatever they may be playing. We have some weird stuff showing up for Modern Night out here, let me tell you. I mean, if you watched last week, you already know that, right? Teamer Reclamation, Grixis Delver. What are you going to do? But just removal is really important for this deck because, again, you want to keep the board state kind of really simplified. Ideally, nobody has anything, and then you just top deck a threat. And that brings us to our last category of cards, which are your actual threats. These are cards that their value is determined by the number of turns you get to untap with them. Like, the threats in Jund and Modern are largely in the category, if you divide your creatures into Muldrifters and Baneslayers, Muldrifters being creatures that give you all of their value whether they live or not, versus Baneslayers, which only give you value by attacking, by existing on the battlefield. You are much more in the Baneslayer camp here. That's not to say they can't give you upfront value, but the long-term value is much higher. So the first one really needs no introduction. It's Tarmogoyf. It's the most efficient creature ever printed, ever. Full stop. It can be, especially in this shell where you're playing, you might go as far as to play a Mishra's Bauble just to help set it up and make it a little bigger, or play a few less lands, or rip through your deck to turn Traverse on to make Death Shadow big. Like, to go get your Death Shadow when you want it. Like, Tarmogoyf gets really big in this deck. Not just because it counts the cards in your graveyard. Like, you can play cards to try to make your Tarmogoyf bigger, but there's also the benefit of being able to take advantage of your opponent's cards that you're ripping out of their hand with Inquisition and Thoughtseize. Like, turn 1, fetch Inquisition into turn 2, turn 2 land Goyf. Can sometimes just buy you a turn 2, 3, 4. Like, that's so dumb. That's such a big creature for 2 mana. And you didn't have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops to get it. It's not like the nasty start out of Grixis Shadow where you would go like turn 1 fetch Thought Scour, turn 2 fetch Thought Scour, Gurmag Angler. Like, that's what you had to do. Or, you would do all that and then looting into Tasigur so that you wouldn't have to exile the looting. Like, that's a lot of hoops to jump through where you can just make a 3/4 Tarmogoyf on turn 2 by ripping an artifact creature out of their hand if you're playing against Affinity. That's it. That's all you gotta do. Silly. The fact is, Tarmogoyf may not be the biggest creature like it used to be. It used to be just the biggest thing at every point in the mana curve, and it only ever cost 2. But now that we have creatures like Hogak, like the Delve creatures, like the litany of cards that other decks are interested in playing, the thing for Tarmogoyf is the amount of effort versus the size you get out of it. You do not have to go to the kind of lengths you do to make your Tarmogoyf with other cards to make your Tarmogoyf big. You just have to play Magic, and your Tarmogoyf gets big. That's why it's so good here. Renin 6, I will slide right into the threats category, because the value it's going to generate is going to be in the form of pressure on your opponent to remove it. They have to kill it before you get to make an emblem, because if you ever get to make an emblem and it doesn't die, they do. Because then you can start plussing to buy back lands to start fueling your retrace. And things just go way downhill for your opponent there. Liliana the Veil, while being a disruption spell, also doubles as a threat, because the more turns you get to sit with her in play, the further behind your opponent gets, both on resources, and they are, you're spiraling ever closer to that ultimate that's just going to break their board in half. She gets to swoop in like Negan and take half your stuff. And then, there's been builds that included cards like Grimflayer to add in the card selection avenue and be just a 2-drop 4/4. There have been builds that included Death Shadow and Traverse the Ulvenwald for card selection. Dark Confidant, I slide in, even though it's card advantage every turn that Dark Confidant lives. So it's, again, another threat that sits on the table that puts your opponent further behind the more times you get to untap with it. So while it is technically card advantage, it is actually just one of your threats. It's one of the ways you win the game. Ripping through your deck a little bit faster, getting an extra card every turn, and just putting your opponent a little bit further behind. That's what you're doing. And then, cards like Bloodbraid Elf still see some play. Not nearly to the level that they used to. Cards like, name a threat. Name a powerful spell. Costs 4, maybe 5 mana or less. You can probably try it out in Jund if it's in those colors. And it probably won't make the deck much worse, and it may make the deck better. That's the thing. It's infinitely customizable. You can tune it to beat what you want to, and that also lends itself well to the sideboard selections. You get access in green, red, and black. You get access to a lot of the best sideboard cards. You get access to Ancient Grudge against Chalice of the Void. You get access to Destructive Revelry if you're a more aggressively slanted version, playing more creatures and less of your disruption and removal. You get access to Leyline and Surgical against the graveyard decks. You get access to additional forms of disruption against the combo decks. You get access to just more threats against control decks. You can set up your 75 to attack a specific tournament. That's what makes Jund so appealing in Modern. It's not that the deck is powerful. It's really not. Your deck power level as a whole is going to be worse than your opponent's. But your individual card quality is not. Each individual card is just a little bit more powerful than the amount of effort you put into it. And that's what you're banking on when you play Jund. You have some long game elements. You have some short game elements. Like, you can get a draw that, rips your opponent's hand apart over the first couple of turns, and then you just drop a Goyf with a bolt up. It's a big Goyf. You bolt their creature, attack them for, 5 or 6, depending. Suddenly you're in the driver's seat. Because, Modern life totals don't start very high. Being in the driver's seat behind a Goyf, or you get a Confidant down early, and you just start drawing all your removal against this creature deck. You start drawing all your trophies and your bolts and your pushes against humans, and they don't kill your Dark Confidant. You start to pull ahead little by little. Each individual card you draw is a little bit more powerful than what your opponent's drawing, or it directly answers what your opponent's drawing. That's the selling point for Jund in Modern. That's why the deck is good. And with the addition of Wrenn and 6 and some of the new potential sideboard cards out of Modern Horizon, I went all this time and didn't even talk about the Black Force, which is really good against cards like specifically Arclight Phoenix or Hogak, or, the various creatures that Dredge uses, Bloodghast and, Bloodghast, Prized Amalgam, and friends. You just get it all off the table. Now I don't take damage from it and or lose to a combo involving it. That's cool. That seems great. Ravenous Trap is another card. You don't want to pay full retail for it, but in Jund you can, because it's just double black too. 4 mana's a lot, but when it keeps you from dying, it's exactly the right amount. And I mean, in the matchups where you're really going to die if you don't resolve Ravenous Trap, it's 0. It costs nothing. So, what do you want to do? So, what is Jund good against? Well, Jund is at its best against linear, unfair decks, whether they are creature-oriented or combo-oriented. Because, game 1, you're medium against everything. But then once you get to your sideboard and you know what you're up against, you know what you have to take away from them, that's where the deck's going to shine. Jund is very much a game 2, game 3 deck. You're okay against most everything in game 1. You're not great against anything. But once you get to touch on that sideboard and you get to bring in what you need against whatever you're fighting against, forget about it. It's a good time. For you as the Jund pilot, not for your opponent. They're not having a great time at all. Bad matchups, you are going to struggle against control a lot. Sometimes you can get really good hands, and it'll feel like you've got a good matchup. But you're both designed to try to play the long game, but they play the long game by adding resources to themselves, while you play the long game by taking away from your opponent. And if you're both playing longer games, it's always better to have more than to take away more. Because having more options lends itself well to playing a longer game. So, that's going to wrap it up for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. Going to find a poll here before long or find a few decks to do getting a couple of messages. Going to find a few decks to do the poll for next week. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you want. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about this deck. Because as much as I like to deride it a little bit, I love it. I've always been a fan of Jund. I played it when it was in Standard. Like Jund Cascade with Blood Red Elf into Lightning and Terminate and Pulse and all that good stuff. Like, I played it in Standard. It was a great deck. I love it. And the only reason I don't play it in some capacity in Modern is just because I can't afford the really good cards. So, I play, bad Izzet Phoenix. What are you going to do? You play with the best cards you have available. And sometimes, when you're playing Jund, you just have access to the best cards. All the time. So, again, let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'll catch you next week. Let's find out what we can do.